Hello there, welcome to Histopod number 4 for the Richard and John unit. This Histopod is all about involvement overseas, part 2. So it's the second part of the involvement overseas. This time it's all about Normandy and the different experiences for Richard and John they had in Normandy. So first off, when we look at this section, the significance of Normandy, it includes a few different aspects. The first one is all about how Richard, John and Philip all competed to get control in Normandy, how John along with Philip had captured land from Richard. Richard returns from his captivity and then attempts quite successfully to regain that. That's the second part, really, is how he manages to regain that land, the process he goes through to regain all that territory that had been lost. And the third section is all about John's experience of losing land in Normandy. So when John takes over after Richard's death, he doesn't do such a good job at all, and he actually loses control of Normandy. All right, so the first bit then is to think about the situation on Richard's return. And we start with a nice little map of France, or what we think of most of modern-day France. And you can see in red, that's Normandy. That's what we're talking about. You've got some of the key bits there. The area between Rouen and Paris, you can see there is labelled as the Vexin. Now that's a really strategically important area between those two capitals. Rouen, the capital of Normandy; Paris, of course, the French king's capital, showing that that particular bit of land in between those two capitals is really, really strategically important. So Normandy itself was a very important area for certainly the English kings, and certainly the French king Philip also had designs upon this land. It was, as you can see, the closest land to the Angevin territory, so the territory of Richard in the south. It joins onto the land they control in the other parts of France, and it also links to England quite easily from there as well. It's also strategically important in the sense of trade. So you've got good links to Northern Europe. You can see Flanders marked on the map there. So the English did a lot of trade with Flanders. So it's a crucial place for trade. It was wealthy in its own right. So it has fertile farming land. It brought in lots of tax from those major towns in Normandy as well. So it all brings in lots of wealth, strategic importance for trade. And of course, whoever controlled that had those advantages. If it was Richard or John, the English gained those advantages. If the French king Philip was able to take control of Normandy, then he would also have those advantages. And of course, it would put him in control of territory close to England, to potentially put England under threat of invasion as well. So Normandy was a very important area. It was under Richard's control, under the Angevin's control originally. What we'll see is that whilst Richard is away on crusade, and certainly whilst he's captured on his way back, lots of Normandy falls under the control of Philip of France. And this is the first bit really for us to have a look through. So whilst Richard was away, most particularly whilst he was in captivity, Philip of France, with John's help, had captured large parts of Normandy and taken over a lot of Richard's territory in that part of northern France. So yeah, John had been working alongside Philip. I'm sure you remember that from our last Histopod. John was he was very reluctant for Richard to be released from captivity because John was taking advantage whilst Richard was away. So Philip and John had taken over large parts of Normandy, so the French king was now in control of a lot of that land. In addition to that, a lot of the Norman barons have been persuaded to switch side over to Philip. So especially along those border areas, go back to that other slide, you can see the bits where the sort of the red meets the green, I suppose. A lot of that border territory, some of the barons in there had switched over to Philip's side, giving Philip a major advantage. And one of the key advantages that Philip had gained whilst Richard was away was he'd captured Gisors Castle. Now, Gisors was strategically between Paris and Rouen in that Vexin area, meaning the control of that castle really gave strategic advantage to Philip. So when Richard does return, of course, we saw last Histopod that eventually Richard was released from his captivity, returned to England. And you may remember the very last thing we said was he set off to France to try to regain Normandy, try to deal with all these issues that have been going on in his absence. So once he does return, a number of things occur, and essentially all these things add up to Richard being successful. So initially, perhaps surprisingly, Richard forgives John for betraying him, for siding with Philip, and John therefore joins Richard's side. Now, as I said, that may sound surprising at first, but you may remember that it's actually a very smart move, and it shows quite a lot about Richard's clever decision making. It would have been quite understandable for him to put John on trial, having been imprisoned, perhaps even executed for his betrayal. He'd fought against his own brother, he'd sided with the French king. But instead, by forgiving John, what it meant was that all of those men on John's side, all of John's armies, rather than fighting against Richard, would now fight for him. So you've now got John on Richard's side. So rather than having an extra sort of enemy, he's now got an extra ally. And that really helps Richard in this fight against Philip. So it's now Richard and John against Philip. And that really is beneficial to Richard. And that shows very quickly Richard was very successful in battle against Philip's forces, as was John. John fighting alongside Richard with his own army, his own forces, was also successful against Philip as well. So militarily, both on the field of battle, but also besieging castles as well, they were very successful against Philip. So militarily, they start to win. As well as that, though, there were other things which helped Richard regain a lot of his territory that help him be so successful in Normandy. The first of which we've got here is he managed to get a lot of barons to switch to his side. He does that in a couple of ways. One key way is through bribery. Simple, join my side and you get a lot of financial reward. So he managed to bribe a lot of barons to join his side. Linked to that is he's also able to get alliances with some really quite important people. The Counts of Flanders, Toulouse and Boulogne all join Richard's side, partly through bribery, persuasion. For example, the Count of Flanders was persuaded to join Richard's side through threats, really. The threat of an embargo, the threat of refusing to trade with him. Now, Flanders did a lot of trade with England, a lot of English wool and English cloth. English wool went to Flanders, where Flanders made the cloth. The key industry of Flanders was making that cloth. So they needed English wool to do that. So if the English stopped sending them wool, their main industry would dry up. So Flanders was convinced, the Count of Flanders was convinced to join Richard's side through threats as much as bribery as well there. All of this, the military victories, the bribery, the important alliances, all these shrewd decisions, all added up to a great deal of success for Richard. So having lost a great deal of Normandy whilst he was away, on his return, he quite quickly regains a lot of his lost territory, and he really does a good job of putting himself back on top. So one other thing that links to Richard's success here, and another thing which really shows how, firstly, how important Normandy was, but also how successful Richard was, is Chateau Gaillard. Now, you can see a nice picture of it there. This was a very significant investment for Richard. This is a very powerful, very well-built castle. It was at the absolute cutting edge of the sort of military technology, I suppose, at the time. Firstly, you can see just how much Normandy meant to Richard. He spent £12,000 building this castle. It took just 2 years to build, incredibly fast building there. Real feat of effort to get that built so quickly. Now, £12,000, well, so what? Is that a lot of money? Well, yeah, it's a huge sum of money. To put that into perspective, £7,000 was the total that Richard spent on all of his other castles combined. So it's almost double the amount he spent on everything else combined. So this castle is a major investment for Richard. It's about him asserting his power and control over Normandy, defending what he's regained, but also potentially attacking as well. So firstly, defensive-wise, you can start to get an impression perhaps from the image there of some of the advantages this has defensively. Firstly, you can see it's high up on a hill above the town, above the river below. Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly incredibly defensible. Attackers, one of the key things attackers did at the time was to try to dig under walls to make them collapse, call it undermining. To tunnel underneath and hopefully the walls would collapse. Well, being on a hill like that meant the attackers couldn't get to the walls to dig underneath them. So they couldn't undermine those walls and make them collapse. So that made it very secure. You also notice the round shape of this castle. Traditionally at this time, most of the castle walls in Europe were angular, they had corners, and that's where the catapults would aim for. They would aim to hit the corners. That's where potentially the weak spots would be, and that was where the walls might collapse. Well, being circular meant there weren't any corners, so it was much stronger to resist those catapults and other sort of siege engines that they had to try to destroy these castles. So defensively, this was, as I say, at the cutting edge of the technology of the time, and it was a really powerful, easy, well defendable castle. In addition, it was also potentially very useful for attack as well. The positioning of it near the Vexin area was ideal to help recapture that key bit of strategic territory between Rouen and Paris, maybe even threaten Philip's land itself, and actually threaten the French king's lands near Paris. You could easily gather together forces here at this castle and launch an assault from here on the French king's land. So certainly there was that potential threat that this could be an attacking structure as well as a defensive one. So on the whole, what we find with Chateau Gaillard built with Richard being so successful on the battlefield, he's been able to regain pretty much all of his lost territory. And as I say, this Chateau Gaillard potentially could even mean he was able to threaten the French king's lands themselves. So he's done a phenomenal job of regaining his land. And then it starts to go wrong. So having been incredibly successful, regaining his territory, with Philip about to agree a truce, they were already negotiating and discussing the terms for finishing the fighting and coming to some sort of peace agreement. It goes all horribly wrong for Richard because he's killed. So he was shot by an arrow. He was surveying his troops in a castle near Limoges. It was a small castle. It wasn't a big deal. Negotiations are going on about a peace treaty. He's not wearing his armor. He's just casually walking along amongst his troops. A lone archer from the battlements managed to shoot him with a crossbow in the shoulder. Doesn't kill him straight away. He's okay. They remove the bolt, but infection sets in. And shortly afterwards, in April 1199, Richard dies. So having pretty much recaptured Normandy, having just about got the French king to give up, he's killed. And of course, once Richard is killed, John takes over. Now, you may remember there was some dispute about who should take over after Richard. If you remember Arthur, Prince Arthur was actually, in theory, the next in line to the throne. He was the son of Richard and John's older brother, who himself had died. So he was technically the next in line. However, it was John who was able to take over, who was, for many reasons, seen as a better candidate. He was seen as English, he was the right age. So he was the one who became king. But he did have some challenges and he did have some problems. And we'll also see that when it comes to Normandy, John was nothing like as successful as Richard. In fact, he has a bit of a disastrous experience, really, in Normandy. So, as you can see, our next question is, how does John lose control of Normandy then? So the key things here are that Richard managed to return from his captivity and regains Normandy. When John takes over, he manages to lose it. So the first thing we should probably just go back to, actually, is that when John does become king, because there was this controversy about whether he or Arthur should take over, in order to get the French king's support and hopefully avoid a war with the French king, John decides he will pay homage to the French king, give him money and a little bit of land as well, in return for the French king, Philip, agreeing for John to become the English king and to not make a fuss and to not try to oppose that. Now, that seems like a smart move. It got the French king's support. It meant that John was now the undisputed king of England. But it does come back to bite him. And this is where we see where it starts to go wrong. So we've got these 5 stages, really, of how John loses control of Normandy. Firstly, then, it all begins with John's marriage. He married someone called Isabelle of Angoulême. Now, again, this was a marriage of strategic importance. It gave him land that Isabelle controlled. She was the heir to. But she was already engaged to marry a man called Hugh de Lusignan. Now, Hugh de Lusignan was John's vassal, so he was beholden to John. So John basically felt, well, so what? I'm going to marry you, can't. Tough. Well, Hugh didn't agree with that, didn't like that very much at all. He disputed this. He challenged John to a duel to decide who could marry. Actually, it was John who challenged Hugh to a duel over who should marry Isabel. Hugh declines that. He says, no, we're not going to have a duel. they would each choose a champion to fight for them. Well, Hugh knew that John would get the best champion, William Marshall, so he would lose. So he's not happy. This is a silly decision from John, but rather than simply refusing to budge and to simply challenge Hugh to a duel, it's escalating the situation. Now, he could quite easily have made amends. He could have given Hugh a little bit of land, given him some money to sort of pay him off. He had that in his power, but instead he just, doesn't really back down. So Hugh appeals to Philip of France for justice, because, of course, Philip was John's overlord. John, having sworn his oath of fealty to Philip, meant that, in theory, Philip was his overlord. So Hugh goes to Philip to ask for his support. So Philip sees an opportunity, to be honest, and so he summons John to his court to answer to these accusations that Hugh has made and to explain himself. Now, John refuses, because he's the King of England. He's not going to be summoned to the King of France's court. He doesn't think he should be summoned. He refuses. He's not be told what to do. Well, as far as Philip is concerned, John is his vassal. So if he's been summoned to see him, he must attend. So by not attending, he has broken his vow to be a loyal vassal of the French king. And so therefore, Philip decides he has the right to declare Normandy and John's lands in France forfeit. And if you remember that, if the lands are forfeit, essentially they no longer belong to you. So Philip is saying that all those lands in France are no longer John's, because John has been a bad vassal and not attended his court. Of course, John doesn't just hand that land over and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, here you go." He fights for it. He says, "No way, this is my land." And so we get war again between, once again, the French king and the English king fighting over Normandy once again. Stage 3 then, remember Arthur, who was the other candidate potentially to become king, still very young at this stage. He's not an adult yet. He pays homage to Philip and is therefore granted those territories by Philip. So basically Philip is now saying Normandy, actually I think he says Normandy is his, but all the rest of John's land is now Arthur's. So Arthur is obviously on Philip's side. And so we end up in this war with Arthur and Philip fighting against John. Now, John does start off quite successfully, actually. He does a spectacular march, and he manages to capture Arthur really quite soon into this fight. It goes very well. Unfortunately, it's John's decision-making which then lets him down. So you may very well remember the story that Arthur, being captured, is imprisoned, and ultimately, rather than treating him as he should be, John decides the best thing to do is to kill him. He wants him removed. So he has Arthur murdered. Some suggest he actually murdered him himself. But either way, Arthur, this noble, John's own nephew, is killed. That's not what should happen. What should happen is that if John doesn't like what Arthur has done, he thinks Arthur's betrayed him, he should put him on trial. Maybe have him executed if he's found guilty. He doesn't do any of that. He just murders him. So that shocks people at the time. It shocks many. Many are outraged that this has happened. John has behaved in a completely unacceptable way. And so many of John's barons who are on his side defect. That means they change sides and they switch over to Philip. And you've got the examples there of the lords from Maine, Anjou, Poitou, all paying homage to Philip and switching over from John's side to Philip's side. You also got the Bretons, that people from Brittany, also supporting the French king. Arthur was from Brittany. He was Arthur of Brittany. So the people from Brittany were also shocked that he'd been killed and side with the French king. So what we find with this decision to kill Arthur is John loses an awful lot of support. You'll remember, of course, that Richard was able to secure control of Normandy by getting loads of people on his side, by bribing them, by making alliances. So having people on your side was the key thing to keeping control of Normandy. And by killing Arthur, John loses the support of many barons in Normandy. So that was or near to Normandy. So that was a real mistake, really, by John. It lost him lots of support. Now, it's a quick leap to number 5. We'll do a bit more detail of this in a second. But the long and the short of it there is, having lost this support, it means John having lost that support, it means that Philip is now able to make great strides and eventually is able to take possession of Normandy after taking over Chateau Gaillard. And ultimately, John is too slow to respond to that siege, so therefore Philip is able to take control of Normandy. There's quite a step between stage 4 and 5 there. So if we look onto this next slide, we'll see a bit more detail about quite what happened, why losing all support of those barons suddenly means that Philip can take control of Normandy. So you'll see firstly, the fact that John had already paid homage to Philip undermined his position. So if a baron who was on John's side doesn't like what he does with Arthur, he could legitimately say he wanted to change sides and join Philip because Philip was John's overlord. So he was simply going above John's head, if you like, and he was still staying on the same side. He would have said, not broken feudal law, because he hasn't betrayed John, because he's just simply siding with Philip, who is John's overlord. It basically meant, according to the technicalities of feudal law, they hadn't officially done anything wrong by switching over to Philip. And that made a big difference. They encouraged them to change sides if they could get away with it. Then another decision from John, which isn't really a very good one, is he decides to return to England in 1203. So he's losing support. He needs more money. He goes back to England to raise more cash. Some suggest he was struggle because he didn't have enough money. All the things like Richard's ransom, the crusade, all these costs meant he was running out of cash. So John returns to England, perhaps to raise some more money to launch another attack, and he does manage to secure more money. But for a lot of people, it looks like he's just deserting them. Those Norman barons fighting against Philip, they've been abandoned by their king. Now, everybody expected John to be going back to Normandy quite quickly, but again, he doesn't do it very quickly at all. He's securing that finance. He does get a scutage raised. He does secure some finance for another attack, for another campaign in Normandy, but he takes too long over it. Some suggest he was waiting for the Pope to try to come to help sort of broker a peace deal between him and Philip, but Philip didn't want a peace deal. He was wanting Normandy. He saw John's weakness and he was trying to take advantage. So with this delay, with the fact that John was taking so long to get back to Normandy to go and help, things really fall apart. So as you see, in March of 1204, Chateau Gaillard, this incredibly powerful castle, this incredibly well defensible castle, falls to Philip. Philip is able to capture this brilliant castle. Now, it's fallen in the end because it had been besieged since the summer of 1203. Basically, it was surrounded, couldn't get any supplies, needed help, needed someone to come and rescue it. And that rescue just didn't come. So it says the inhabitants of the castle had been expecting John to send relief, but it never came. And as it says, even a castle like Chateau Gaillard could not last forever without outside help. It's all very well having thick walls and being on a hill, but if you've got no food, if you haven't got anyone to come to your rescue, you're going to eventually have to give up. Because John took so long returning to try to perhaps help Chateau Gaillard, eventually it falls to Philip. And of course, that gives Philip control of this really powerful castle. It gives him the massive advantage that had. And basically, once Chateau Gaillard had fallen, Philip was able to overrun all of Normandy. Town by town, they fell to him, including in the end, the capital of Normandy, Rouen, in June 1204. And that makes Philip Lord of Normandy. And it's a complete disaster for John. He's completely lost control of Normandy. It means the rest of his lands in France are under real threat as well. He's struggling to keep control of them. Now, without Normandy, it makes that very, very difficult. He gets the nickname of Soft Sword because he was a very weak leader in battle. And ultimately, this gives John the headache for the next decade. He's spending trying to get Normandy back. And of course, in the next couple of Histopods, you'll see how this causes John untold problems going forward. He needs to get Normandy back for its finances, for the kind of the morale idea of having Normandy under his control, but he just doesn't manage to do it. So hopefully then you've seen the three key bits here are Normandy was really important to everybody. Rich did a great job of regaining Normandy, and John ultimately fails in Normandy completely, and unfortunately completely loses control. Okay, thanks very much for listening, everyone. Hope you found that useful.